They said the Dalton children were gone forever. The night they disappeared in 1979, the whole town of Ashgrove gathered in the cold mist outside their farmhouse, holding lanterns and calling their names through the trees. Only the wind answered back. The dinner table inside was still set, 3 plates, half-eaten bread, and a lamp flickering weakly. The radio hummed a gospel tune that seemed to stretch on for hours after the searchers had left. It was as if time itself had paused in that kitchen, waiting for something that would never return. The Dalton family's farmhouse stood on the edge of Ashgrove, a quiet town surrounded by endless acres of pine and fog. In the fall of 1979, when the nights began to stretch longer and the harvest moon burned orange over the fields, the unthinkable happened. The 3 Dalton children, Emily, Peter, and Samuel, vanished without a sound. Their mother had set dinner on the table that evening, roast chicken and buttered corn, while their father listened to the radio in the living room. The old clock above the mantel struck 7, and the house fell into a silence that no one noticed at first. It was only when Mrs. Dalton called her children for supper that she realized something was wrong. Their coats still hung by the door, their shoes were neatly lined up by the rug, and the back door was wide open, swinging slowly in the wind. Outside, the air was heavy with the smell of rain, and the fields glowed pale beneath the rising moon. By the time the neighbors arrived, the entire Dalton home seemed frozen in time. The dinner plate sat untouched, the radio hummed softly, and a single candle flickered as if afraid to die out. Sheriff Connolly and a team of volunteers spread across the property, flashlights cutting through the mist, calling the children's names. They found small footprints in the mud leading toward the forest behind the house, but they stopped abruptly at the tree line, as if the children had stepped into the dark and simply vanished. The search stretched through the night, but no one found a trace, no clothing, no signs of struggle, not even a broken branch to suggest where they had gone. Rumors began to spread through Ashgrove within days. Some said a drifter had taken them, others whispered about the old well that sat half-collapsed behind the Dalton barn, covered in vines and sealed years ago after a farmhand fell in. The older folks muttered that the forest had always been wrong, that strange lights moved between the trees after midnight and voices sometimes called from within. The police wrote it off as a missing persons case, but there was something about the Dalton home that made the officers uneasy. The air felt heavier there, and even the dogs refused to go near the tree line. In the weeks that followed, the Dalton family withdrew, their laughter gone, their fields left unharvested, and the town quietly decided to stop asking questions about what happened the night the children disappeared from their dinner table and stepped into the darkness that never gave them back. The woods behind the Dalton farmhouse had always been dense and strangely quiet, the kind of place where sound seemed to sink into the soul instead of echoing back. When the children first went missing, that forest became the heart of the town's fear. Search parties gathered with lanterns, flashlights, and dogs, sweeping through the tangled undergrowth, calling the Dalton children's names until their voices went hoarse. The rain had started to fall that night, light at first, then heavier, turning the ground to soft mud that swallowed footprints and erased any trace of direction. The tall trees leaned close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the moonlight, and every path seemed to lead deeper into shadows that never ended. The air smelled of rot and wet bark, and more than one volunteer claimed to hear faint whispers carried by the wind, voices that seemed to repeat the names of the missing children. By morning, the forest looked almost untouched, as if no one had walked through it at all. It was the deputy, a young officer named Clark, who found the only clue, a small, mud-covered shoe lying near an old well overgrown with moss and thorn vines. It was a child's shoe, scuffed and waterlogged, but unmistakably Emily Dalton's, her initials stitched faintly into the leather by her mother. The sight of it stopped the entire search. Some believed it meant the children had fallen into the well, but when the rescuers tried to look inside, they found it sealed with a heavy stone slab, too large for a child to move. Beneath it, faint drafts of cold air slipped through the cracks, carrying a smell no one could quite describe, something metallic, like rust, mixed with decay. The search extended for several days after that, but the discovery of the shoe changed everything. It was as if the forest itself was mocking them, offering just enough hope to keep them wandering in circles. Dogs barked at unseen shapes. Flashlights flickered out without warning. One man swore he saw small figures darting between the trees, but when he ran after them, the forest shifted around him, and he found himself standing beside the same old well once again. The townspeople began to fear the woods, avoiding the area even in daylight. The sheriff eventually called off the search, insisting they had done all they could, but everyone in Ashgrove knew the truth. They found the Dalton children because the forest hadn't let them. And whatever had taken those children was still waiting beneath those trees, breathing quietly in the dark. 6 months after the disappearance, when the town had finally begun to move on, the Dalton children came back. It was late on a Sunday night, during a storm that rolled in from the west like a wall of thunder. Rain beat against the tin roofs, lightning cracked open the sky, and the wind howled through the empty fields. Most of Ashgrove had gone to bed early, the town still nursing a quiet sadness that no one spoke about anymore. Then, near midnight, Deputy Clark received a call from a truck driver who claimed he had seen 3 children standing by the old crossroads near the forest's edge. They were barefoot, soaked in rain, and staring straight ahead as if waiting for something. The deputy thought it was a cruel prank at first, but when he arrived and turned his headlights toward the ditch by the road, his breath caught in his throat. There they were, Emily, Peter, and Samuel Dalton, exactly as they had been the night they disappeared. Their clothes were the same, though dry and untouched by time. Their hair was neat, their faces pale but calm. Clark called their names, but none of them answered. They didn't shiver, didn't blink, didn't move until he stepped out of his car. Only then did Emily lift her head and look at him, her eyes glassy and far too dark. When he brought them back to town, the children didn't speak a single word, not to their parents, not to the doctors, not even to each other. They simply sat together, holding hands, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on something no one else could see. At first, the town rejoiced. Church bells rang the next morning, and neighbors brought food to the Dalton home, calling it a miracle. But behind the smiles, people whispered. The children didn't eat, didn't sleep, and seemed unaffected by the passage of time. Their skin was cold to the touch, their pulses faint. When the doctor tried to draw blood, he said it was like the veins resisted the needle. And that night, the Dalton house glowed faintly from within, as though a dim lantern burned behind the walls. The parents refused to let anyone question them further, clinging to their children with desperate love, pretending everything was normal. But the town could feel it, the air around the Daltons had changed. The wind near their house carried a low hum, and the forest behind them seemed to bend closer each night, as though it were watching what it had sent back. When the doctors examined the Dalton children, the Daltons' brief joy turned into silent terror. At first glance, the children looked perfectly healthy, no bruises, no cuts, no signs of neglect or starvation. But something about them was wrong in a way that no medical book could explain. Their skin was pale and smooth, untouched by sunlight or dirt, and their eyes seemed to hold no reflection, as if the light around them simply disappeared when it reached their pupils. The strangest part came when the doctors compared old photographs and medical records from before their disappearance. Every detail matched exactly: the length of their hair, the chipped tooth Emily had lost, the scar on Peter's hand. Even the scrape on Samuel's knee, which his mother remembered treating the night they vanished, was still fresh, unaltered, as though time itself had never touched them. The hospital staff ran every test they could. Blood work showed no abnormalities, yet the results felt incomplete, as if the samples weren't entirely human. Their vital signs were faint but steady, their heartbeats slow and unnervingly synchronized, as though the 3 were sharing one rhythm. When they were placed in separate rooms, the monitors began to flicker and fail, and each child's pulse weakened until they were brought back together again. That was when the medical team noticed something chilling. The temperature in their room was always several degrees lower than the rest of the building, and whenever anyone stood too close for too long, their breath turned visible, like standing outside in winter air. The Daltons insisted on taking their children home after a few days, refusing further testing. They said the kids just needed rest and peace. The town doctor, shaken and sleepless, didn't argue. But word spread quickly. People whispered that the Dalton children were no longer the same ones who had vanished. Neighbors claimed they saw the 3 standing in the yard at night, facing the woods, not moving for hours. Others swore they saw shapes behind the windows, faint silhouettes that didn't match the children's small frames. Even their voices, when they finally spoke, had changed, slow, deliberate, and oddly hollow, as if echoing from a distance. The more the town tried to pretend everything was fine, the clearer it became that whatever had returned wasn't bound by the same rules of life the rest of them lived by. The Dalton children had come back exactly as they were on the night they disappeared, and that was the part that terrified everyone the most. They hadn't aged, they hadn't changed, they had simply come back frozen in the moment they were taken, carrying with them the silence of whatever place they had been. After the Dalton children returned, Ashgrove began to change in ways no one could ignore. It started small, livestock refusing to graze near the Dalton property, dogs howling at night, the forest seeming to press closer each day as if it were creeping toward the town. But soon the unease turned into something far darker. Farmers woke to find their fields ruined overnight, their crops withered to grey husks despite the steady rain. Black, tar-like water began seeping up through the soil behind the Dalton farmhouse, thick and foul-smelling, staining the earth and spreading slowly like a wound. No one could explain it. The well that had long been sealed now groaned at night, as if something deep within it was shifting, moving, breathing. Neighbors who once pitied the Daltons now crossed the street to avoid their home. The children rarely left the house, but when they did, people swore the air turned heavy, the birds went silent, and shadows seemed to bend toward them. Mrs. Dalton tried to keep life normal, she still hung laundry outside, still lit candles at dusk, but even she began to look different. Her face grew pale, her eyes hollow. Mr. Dalton stopped going to town altogether, locking himself in the barn most nights, where people said they could hear him talking softly to no one. Then came the voices. Late at night, residents near the Dalton property began hearing faint whispers drifting through their windows, voices of children, laughing one moment, crying the next. The sound was distant, like it came from beneath the ground, or the trees, or the walls themselves. When people followed the noise, it always led them back to the edge of the woods. Some claimed they saw figures moving between the trees, small and pale, just out of sight. Others said the forest had begun to hum, a low vibration that could be felt through the soles of their feet. The town's fear grew into panic after a week of unexplained events. Horses were found dead in their stables, their bodies drained of blood but untouched otherwise. Wells overflowed with dark water. The church bell rang by itself one night, though the rope hung still. The Daltons said nothing through it all, and the children simply stared when asked questions, their eyes distant, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Ashgrove had always been a quiet, decent town, but the return of the Dalton children brought with it a silence that felt alive, a silence that whispered of something ancient stirring beneath its roots, waiting for the rest of the town to hear it too. The truth about Ashgrove's past began to surface when a local historian named Martha Leland decided to dig through the town's oldest church records. She was a quiet woman who had lived in Ashgrove all her life, and she'd grown uneasy watching her neighbors change, some whispering about curses, others refusing to leave their homes after dark. The strange events surrounding the Dalton children had shaken the entire town, but Martha had seen something like this before, written in fragments of old journals stored in the church basement. Most people had forgotten those records existed, covered in dust and mildew, dating back to the early 1800s when Ashgrove was first founded. As the days grew darker and more unnatural occurrences spread, she began reading through them night after night, and what she uncovered filled her with a quiet dread. The records spoke of disappearances. Not one, not two, but dozens, stretching back nearly 2 centuries. Every 40 years, 3 children from Ashgrove vanished without explanation. It was written in neat, fading ink by town elders who described the disappearances as necessary sacrifices for the preservation of our home. The disappearances were followed by prosperity, the fields flourished, sickness vanished, and the townsfolk prospered. Yet after every 40-year cycle, something changed. The town's soul would darken, the trees grew thicker, and shadows stretched longer across the streets. The pattern repeated itself through generations, always hidden beneath polite silence. Marta traced the dates, 1839, 1879, 1919, 1959, and then 1979, the year the Dalton children disappeared. It was no coincidence. The names of the missing children were different each time, but the place was always the same, the farms that bordered the forest on the Dalton Satch. The same forest where the Dalton farmhouse now stood. In the margins of one old ledger, she found a note scrawled by a trembling hand, the debt must be kept. The forest remembers. That single line haunted her. As she pieced together the records, Martha realized that Ashgrove had been built on a bargain long forgotten by its people. The founders, desperate to survive harsh winters and failed harvests, had turned to rituals once whispered by settlers who claimed to have learned them from the land itself. In exchange for protection and abundance, the town had to give something pure, something untainted: children. The pattern had continued long after the founders died, buried beneath time and denial. But now, with the Dalton children's return, it was clear that the cycle had been broken or perhaps interrupted. What David had once been appeased was no longer satisfied, and the forest was stirring again, restless for the payment that had kept it quiet for generations. Reverend Hill had been the Dalton's pastor for nearly 50 years, a man respected for his calm sermons and unwavering faith. He had baptized nearly everyone in Ashgrove, buried their dead, and preached through every storm that had come to test the town. But when Martha Leland brought him the old records she had uncovered, the color drained from his face. He stared at the pages for a long time, his lips trembling as if he were reading the words of his own confession. For days afterward, he was seen walking alone through the cemetery behind the church, whispering prayers that no one could hear. Finally, on a Sunday morning, as the church bells rang and the congregation gathered, Reverend Hill stepped up to the pulpit with shaking hands and eyes full of sorrow. What he confessed that morning would shatter whatever peace Ashgrove had left. He told them that the stories were true, that the Dalton's founders had made a pact more than a century. Aguas Grove, he said, had been dying in its earliest days. Crops failed, children starved, and a sickness swept through the valley. In desperation, the founding families sought help from a preacher who was not from any church they knew, a man who spoke of the spirit beneath the roots and promised to bless the town in exchange for devotion. But devotion, the preacher said, had to be proven through sacrifice. The founders agreed. They gave 3 children to the forest that year, offered them near the old well as the preacher chanted words no one could understand. The following spring, the land flourished, the rains returned, and Ashgrove began to thrive. From that moment on, the town was bound by its own secret covenant. Reverend Hill explained that every generation, the ritual was renewed in silence. The chosen families were sworn never to speak, and the town leaders ensured the pattern continued. But somewhere along the way, the ritual had stopped. In 1979, when it came time for the offering, the chosen family, unknown to most, refused to go through with it. The preacher who had guided the rituals never returned, and those who knew the truth chose to bury it. He said he had been just a young priest then, told to forget what he saw, but the memory had never left him. He confessed that he had seen the Dalton children near the well days before they vanished, playing where no one was supposed to go. With trembling hands, he told his congregation that the town had broken its promise, and now the forest was reclaiming what it was owed. He wept as he spoke, saying the evil beneath Ashgrove had been patient, but patience, like mercy, had its limits. After Reverend Hill's confession, the Dalton house became the center of a darkness that no one could deny. It began with sounds, soft, rhythmic knocks from behind the walls, like something crawling through the wooden beams. Dalton tried to ignore them, telling herself it was just the house settling, but the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. At night, the family heard footsteps moving up and down the hallway even when everyone was in bed. Doors creaked open on their own, the lights flickered, and sometimes the house seemed to breathe, the wallpaper swelling and contracting as if the walls themselves were alive. The air turned cold enough to make frost form on the inside of the windows, and the smell of damp earth filled every room. One night, Dalton woke to find Emily standing at the foot of her bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. When she tried to touch her, Emily whispered something in a language that sent chills through her mother's spine, a harsh, guttural sound that didn't seem human. The boys began to whisper to each other constantly, speaking in that same tongue, their voices low and synchronized. Dalton boarded up the windows, burned incense, and even called a priest from a nearby town, but nothing changed. If anything, the disturbances grew worse. The priest stayed for less than an hour before leaving, pale and shaken, muttering that there was something in that house he could not face. Soon, black stains began to appear on the walls, seeping from beneath the paint like veins spreading outward. The stains pulsed faintly in the dark, and when Dalton tried to scrub them away, the walls bled a thick, foul-smelling liquid. The floorboards warped, the ceilings groaned, and the house echoed with distant crying that seemed to come from beneath the floor. The children, once silent and laughless, now spoke more often, but only to each other. They laughed quietly at night, their voices overlapping in strange, melodic patterns. Sometimes, their laughter would stop all at once, followed by silence so heavy it made the air feel solid. Neighbors began hearing noises from the house after midnight, chanting, scrapping, and the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the floor. Those who passed by swore they saw faint lights moving inside even when the Daltons claimed to be asleep. It was as though the house itself had become a vessel, feeding off the energy of what had returned. People started calling it the waking house, whispering that whatever the Daltons had brought back with them was no longer hiding. It was alive, restless, and waiting for something only it remembered. The discovery of the forgotten cellar beneath the Dalton farmhouse began as an accident. Mr. Dalton, desperate to find the source of the strange noises that echoed through the house each night, decided to tear up the old floorboards in the kitchen. It was convinced there were rats nesting underneath or maybe a broken pipe causing the damp smell that had overtaken the home. But when he pried up the first few boards, he found something no one expected, an old, rotting trapdoor hidden beneath layers of wood and dust. It had no handle, only deep scratches where someone had once tried to claw it open. The hinges were rusted, and the air that escaped when he lifted it was heavy, cold, and foul, smelling of decay and age. With a lantern in hand, Mr. Dalton descended the narrow stone steps while his wife and children watched from above. The light flickered against the walls, revealing markings carved deep into the stone, symbols no one recognized, arranged in spirals that seemed to twist inward. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a small chamber that looked far older than the house itself. The walls were lined with strange objects, wooden effigies with hollow eyes, rusted chains embedded into the rock, and bones half buried in the dirt floor. In the center of the room lay a circle drawn in dried black residue, its edges decorated with symbols identical to those carved into the walls. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that this cellar wasn't built by the Daltons, nor by anyone who'd lived in recent memory. It was older, ancient, perhaps, something left behind by those who had once performed the same rituals Reverend Hill had described. When Mrs. Dalton followed her husband down, she found him kneeling near a small pile of objects in the corner, remnants of children's toys, a porcelain doll's head, a wooden horse, and tiny bones wrapped in fabric. She screamed, realizing what they were. The cellar, it seemed, was not just a chamber but a burial ground. The walls almost seemed to hum with a faint vibration, a low sound that neither of them could explain. The moment they stepped back toward the stairs, the lantern's flame went out, plunging them into total darkness. Mrs. Dalton swore she heard breathing, soft, rapid, and close, coming from all around them. When they finally escaped and sealed the trapdoor behind them, the house fell eerily silent for the first time in weeks, as though whatever had been waiting below now knew it had been found and was simply biding its time. When the truth about the cellar spread through Ashgrove, panic turned into hysteria. The sheriff tried to dismiss it as rumor, but those who had seen the Dalton house knew better. The smell of decay had grown stronger, and the black water that seeped from the ground was now running down the road like veins of tar. People began leaving town quietly at night, loading trucks and wagons without saying goodbye. The few who stayed noticed that the air itself seemed heavier, the sky darker, even at noon. It was as if the town had been forgotten by the sun. Then came the voices again, louder, clearer, and closer than ever before. They no longer came from the woods or the well, they came from beneath the streets, whispering through the cracks in the ground, calling names that no one had spoken in years. It was Martha Leland who realized what was happening. The Dalton children had not been returned, they had been delivered back as messengers, carrying the weight of a broken covenant. The sacrifices of the past had held something at bay, something vast and ancient, rooted deep beneath the forest. With the ritual broken, that force was waking, and the town's foundations were beginning to rot. Reverend Hill tried to gather the townsfolk at the church to pray, but the ground beneath the chapel trembled, and a sound like distant wailing rose from below. Windows shattered, candles extinguished, and a thick black mist poured through the aisles. Those who were there said the mist carried faces, hundreds of them, smiled, pale, and twisted in silent screams. Meanwhile, the Dalton house began to collapse inward. The walls cracked, the roof bowed, and a deep rumbling shook the earth around it. Neighbors who watched from a distance said they saw figures in the windows, children, dozens of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces pressed against the glass. When the final crash came, the entire structure sank into the earth as if swallowed whole. The forest behind it groaned like a living thing, and a wave of cold wind swept through the town, carrying the scent of wet soil and decay. By morning, nothing remained of the Dalton farmhouse but a blackened hollow where the cellar had been. The forest had stretched further overnight, its trees now standing where the road once ran. The town was quiet, too quiet, as though holding its breath. The few who remained swore they could still hear laughter echoing faintly through the woods, the laughter of children, carried by the wind, reminding Ashgrove that the dead had finally come due, and the roots beneath it had reclaimed what was theirs.